Well, right in the run up to these EU elections, it's become extremely obvious that far right and fringe parties, including some of them on the far left, by the way,
Mm.
are sort of coalescing to form potentially the only real opposition inside the European Parliament. Now, broadly speaking, what's interesting is that post Brexit, the European Parliament has actually swung more and more towards the centre right. Yes, it's a logistical nightmare, one I've had the pleasure of covering in many years gone by. Obviously, in the UK, this is no longer relevant to UK citizens and their daily lives post Brexit. But it is really important because what it does is it sets up the machinery that governs the EU and its big strategic directions over the next few years. Whoever is voted in terms of sort of the makeup of this European Parliament will have a huge say on whether or not Ursula von der Leyen, the former Defence Secretary of Germany, gets a second term at the helm of that all-important European Commission. And also remember that this is the only real vestige of democracy in terms of direct democracy across the EU, because this is the body that actually rubber stamps those laws when the EU has its agenda, manages to get it through various sort of country levels. It has to go through the European Parliament to actually become law. So it is really important. It's also a fulcrum for far-right activity. This is a platform that many politicians, and you mentioned Geert Wilders there in the Netherlands before, have used over the last 20 years very, very astutely to give themselves an opportunity to pitch themselves as domestic leaders, not just leaders in this big, very big body that people find sometimes can be a morass of bureaucracy that's a little bit distant from them. They can use it to say, well, I could be your next leader. And they've used it with like, for instance, Geert Wilders. Now, broadly speaking, what's interesting is that post-Brexit, the European Parliament has actually swung more and more towards the centre right. So it looks as though the Conservative parties, ones that, for instance, Ursula von der Leyen hails from, that milieu is going to gain the largest share of the vote. But they have a bit of a conundrum here because their main opponent is probably going to end up being also from the right of the spectrum, but this time the far right. They could get up to 25% of the vote across all of these different countries. That really worries policymakers because what it could do is sort of knock European cohesive policy off of its axis at a time when obviously, there's still a war going on into its third year in Ukraine. And there are lots of issues that the EU has to sort out cohesively for the next 4 or 5 years. Not least the fact that, the Franco-German axis has been wobbling. That's the main machinery of how the EU works. President Macron of France famously doesn't get on very well with a weak coalition leader over in Germany, Olaf Scholz. And Macron of France won't be able to stand for another term. His presidency comes to an end in 2027. And so the far right really is France is the place where everybody's looking at the far right to see whether or not this is going to be the moment where you see the far right moving from transition inside the European Parliament into the Élysée Palace over in France. And again, that could have a huge impact on the EU. Now, just one thing a caveat to all of this with is that the far right across the European Parliament is in two parties, and they're by no means let's say, joined when it comes to various policy initiatives. You've got the ID, the Identity and Democracy Party, Marine Le Pen is part of that, but you've also got another one, the European Conservatives and Reformists, that Giorgia Meloni's party belongs to as well. Inside all of these fringe elements, inside these parties, there's all these different fringe elements that don't see eye to eye on, for instance, the war in Ukraine, whether Ukraine should join the EU, how to deal with Russia. And so even if these parties, broadly speaking, get about a quarter of the vote, it's unlikely that they're going to be able to coalesce to really challenge things and upset policy for the next few years.
And you mentioned, Nina, of course, post-Brexit, what is the sort of everyday impact of these European parliamentary elections on people in the UK. But I suppose actually you've just mentioned a couple of examples that actually the UK needs to work with the European Parliament on things like security issues, like Ukraine, like Russia. And so what could this do for relations between the UK and the European Parliament?
Well, again, the axis of this, the main generator for that relationship will obviously be France because of the boats that come across the channel and the pressures on immigration in the UK post Brexit. Obviously, immigration has spiked since then. But immigration is one of the key arguments that people have in the back of their minds when these 373 million EU citizens go to the polls over the next few days. And many of them will be lured by that very seductive argument that far-right parties make, which is, well, look, less Europe and less free movement inside Europe is the answer here. You know, protectionism for our economies to make sure that jobs can be given to whether it's French people or German people, and less competition from people coming from abroad. These are very, very seductive arguments that gain traction on both sides of the channel. What obviously a future government of the UK post the 4th of July will try and do is foster closer ties with, as I was saying before, France and other EU member states. The question is, if you start to get this push from the far right, will EU policy makers and presidents and prime ministers across this bloc, be distracted about other things rather than necessarily be willing to engage in that argument hugely with the UK at a time when obviously they're thinking about security. Callum, you mentioned security, and that is the crucial one upon which this election is also being fought by the centre right. Their argument is that, the centre right offers a big cohesive defence vision here. What they want to do, Emmanuel Macron is pushing for this as well, is to try and make sure that Europe, post in a future era, if Donald Trump gets back into office in November in the United States, and the fact that he's made it very clear he wants to retrench from America's key role as security guarantor in parts of Europe, that France could pick up the mantle of that. France is a big defense manufacturer. It's got a big nuclear deterrent. And so those are the kind of conversations that the centre right is going to try and, push towards. And the UK, by the way, as a having Brexited member now, no longer part of the EU, could play a role in that. If Germany's not too comfortable with France taking the lead on defense, Germany could buy more weaponry and have more alliances, defense alliances and conversations with the UK. And that, on the other hand, could help to warm the relationship with the EU. So offering defense cooperation from the UK's point of view to try and get back into Europe in some way, trading wise.
Nina, that is so helpful. Thank you so much. Thanks for speaking to us.
Thank you.
Nina Dos Santos there, broadcaster, former CNN Europe editor as well.